So have you ever tried to make a change in how you manage your time? Like try to let go of some of your activities so you have less but more important things to focus on? I have. When I was in my final year at university, it turned out that I had taken enough courses that I didn't need to take a full course load in my last year. I only needed 3 courses each term to graduate. And so I kind of thought, okay, this is great. I've kind of been a maybe slightly better than mediocre student, and I thought, this is my chance. I can really focus on my studies and, get really great grades my last year of university. Sounds like a good plan, right? Right. So I registered for my 3 courses, and then I took a part-time job at the after-school care center where I'd worked the year before. And then I got even more involved in the environmental advocacy work that I was doing with the student group on campus. And then I decided to join the worship team at the worship committee at the UU church where I was going while I was at school. Bye, plan. But it turned out that it was such a good year. And it turns out that just focusing on academics was not right for me. Getting to take courses that I was really interested in was great, but having time for work and service or volunteering that was meaningful, like at the end of this year, I remember thinking, oh, my life felt so balanced, especially compared to the years before. And my grades were basically the same as the years before. But I was so much happier and so much less stressed out. And so since that time, I've had other times when I felt way more unbalanced in my life, and then I've had other times when I have felt like I've kind of hit on that sweet spot of the right mix for me of work and play and service. And so part of why I come to church is because when I come to church each week, I am invited into reflection. And so I have this chance to pause and check in. And I can ask myself questions like, how balanced is my life these days? And I have time to think about, do I want to do something about that if I don't like the answer that bubbles up? And so it doesn't really, no matter how balanced or lopsided I'm feeling, when I come to church, I'm not only invited into reflection, but I am part of a community of other thoughtful, faithful people who are all walking along this same balance beam of life, if you will. And they're all asking themselves these same questions. And so no matter how wobbly or centered my steps are on that balance beam, when I'm at church, I know that I'm not alone.
Nigel Marsh began his TED Talk like this. What I thought I would do is I would start with a simple request. I'd like all of you to pause for a moment, you wretched weaklings, and take stock of your miserable existence. Now, that was the advice, he said, that Saint Benedict gave his rather startled followers in the 5th century. Nigel Marsh is a management consultant, and his best-known book is Fat, 40, and Fired. He goes on to say, it was Benedict's advice that I decided to follow myself when I turned 40. Up until that moment, I'd been that classic corporate warrior. I was eating too much, I was drinking too much, I was working too hard, and I was neglecting the family. And I decided that I would try and turn my life around. In particular, I decided I would try to address the thorny issue of work-life balance. Thus began a years-long journey that led Nigel to writing that book and making 4 key observations, he says. 4 key observations. And in thinking about measuring the balance of our time, this theme of balance that we're exploring in March, one of his observations jumped out at me to share. He said, we have to be careful with the time frame that we choose upon which to judge our balance. We have to be careful with the time frame that we choose upon which to judge our balance. Before I went back to work after what he had spent a year just tending to his own personal life and family, I sat down and I wrote out a detailed step-by-step description of the ideal balanced day that I aspired to. The ideal balanced day. And it went like this. Wake up well-rested after a good night's sleep. Have sex. Walk the dog. Have breakfast with my wife and children. Have sex again. Drive the kids to school on the way to the office. Do 3 hours work. Play a sport with a friend at lunchtime. Do another 3 hours work. Meet some mates in the pub for an early evening drink. Drive home for dinner with my wife and kids. Meditate for half an hour. Have sex. Walk the dog. Have sex again. Go to bed. Then he asked, how often do you think I had that day? We need to be realistic, he said. So you can't do it all in just one day. We need to elongate the time frame upon which we judge the balance in our life. But we need to elongate it without falling into the trap of, I'll have a life when I retire, when my kids have left home, when my wife has divorced me, when my health is failing, when I've got no mates or interests left. A day is too short. After I retire is too long. There's got to be a middle way. I'll have a life when. Can anyone relate to that thought? Hope I'm not alone. You know, we speak litanies in church sometimes, repetitive phrases about our longings or aspirations. And I think we also speak internal litanies in our monologues in our heads, litanies to reassure or maybe convince ourselves that we're doing the best we can. Sometimes these litanies become a peculiar blend of self-compassion and self-limitation. I wonder if you've heard a litany like this in yourself or from someone you love. It would be great to meditate for an hour each day, even half an hour each day, but who has time for that? It would be great to spend more time on house projects, but who has time for that? I've always wanted to study that language, that history, whatever it is, but who has time for that? I'd love to devote a weekend every month to that hobby, but who has time for that? I'd love to get more exercise, get more fit, but who has time for that? It would be great to stay in touch better with my mother, father, my daughter, my brother, my cousins, but I just can't find the time. I'd love to find more time to spend with my kids, but who has time for that? I'd love to take a deep breath every now and then. Who has time for that? You know, it seems reasonable, maybe even judicious at first, this litany. But as it gets further and further out, the logic doesn't hold up. And when I'm living from this litany, I've realized it doesn't actually matter what I've filled my days with. Even if I've scheduled in just the right amount of time for exercise and study and play, if I feel ruled by the schedule, if I'm telling myself I just have to get through the next thing, I'm caught up in what I might name the Chronos litany. You might be familiar with this distinction of the ancient Greeks of 2 words for time, chronos and kairos. Chronos is clock time. That's measurable, quantitative time, seconds and minutes and hours. Actually, in ancient India, Hindus made a similar distinction in Sanskrit. between kala and ritu. And from kala, the word for quantitative time, like chronos, comes Kali, the goddess, who's often depicted with the dancing on corpses with her belt of skulls. So I find it fascinating that in both of those cultures, the gods associated with clock time, Kronos in the Greek pantheon and Kali in the Hindu, were gods who wielded great destructive forces. Kronos, or Kala, quantitative time, constructed in the symbolism of the ancient ancestors, was a force to be feared, the bringer of old age and death. But qualitative time was a very different matter. Unlike the aged father time image of Kronos, Kairos was represented by a young man, beautiful and lithe, winged and dexterous. The inscription below the most famous statue of Kairos in Sicyon was a little question and answer interview with the personification of this different sort of time. Here's how it went. And who are you? Time, Kairos, who subdues all things. And why do you stand on tiptoe? I am ever running. And why do you have a pair of wings on your feet? I fly with the wind. And why do you hold a razor in your right hand? As a sign that I am sharper than any sharp edge. And why does your hair hang over your face? For they who meet me to take me by the forelock. And why, in heaven's name, is the back of your head bald? Because none whom I have once raced by on my winged feet will now, though they wish it sore, take hold of me from behind. Why did the artist fashion you? For your sake, stranger. And he set me up in the porch as a lesson. Kairos time is about the quality, not the length of the moment. Kairos offers opportunity. Whoever meets me takes me by the forelock, but does not linger. Kairos time distinguishes what is possible in one moment from another. It's the words the Greeks used to translate that famous bit of Ecclesiastes that we sang earlier, a time for this and a time for that. To live in Kairos time is to be present to the moment, attuned to what is ripe, what the stakes and the possibilities are at hand. Often, Kairos is talked about in terms of cultural moments, large-scale world events, but I think it can also be quite personal, an internal experience of one's orientation towards time. And here's my sense, I'd be curious to hear if it resonates with you, the kind of time that I am placing my attention on, Chronos or Kairos, has much more to do with the quality of my day than whatever it is that I've lined up on my calendar. The kind of time that I'm paying my attention to has more to do with the quality of my day than what I have lined up on the calendar. With the same schedule of appointments, I can hustle through a Chronos day, always worrying whether I'm ahead of schedule or behind, about how efficient I am about using my time. Or I can relax into a Kairos day, greeting each moment, each meeting or task for what's ripe in it. And once when I was feeling like day after day I was living in that Chronos way, tumbling from one appointment to the next in a headlong rush of overwhelm, a spiritual director offered me a very simple practice that shifted everything, so I wanted to share it with you. He said, take a moment each time you transition from one thing to the next, just a moment. And for me, this has become a key to balance in time, attention to transitions. You know, it's why in the Jewish tradition you mount a mezuzah on the doorframe. Familiar with those little metal, often ceramic case that holds a bit of scripture, of text. And as you pass through the door frame, the tradition goes that you at least notice it. Notice this transition you're making. If not, touch it and bring your fingers to your lips. And so in these transitional moments, the spiritual director said, ask yourself 4 questions. What just happened? So I begin to just name for myself what I'd just done. How am I feeling? Take a moment to check in with the emotional quality of my being, always present, not just when I'm feeling big emotions. What am I grateful for? Appreciating, savoring the qualities of the moment I've just experienced. I found that would heighten my experience of presence, of love for life. And then what do I get to do next? What do I get to do next? Wow, the difference between that question and the harried glance at my calendar as if it were a train barreling down on me. What just happened? How am I feeling? What am I grateful for? What do I get to do next? Usually takes a minute or less of Chronos time, this practice of tuning into the quality of the moment, of returning to Kairos. Sometimes, though, it really is about how much we are trying to do or take responsibility for. So I wanted to offer you this wisdom from Reverend Meg Barnhouse about keeping too much off of our calendars and our minds. She says, I love for a waitress to call me Hun. It's comforting. She doesn't know me and I don't know her, but we fit into well-worn, ancient categories. I am the hungry one and she is the one who brings nourishment from unseen sources. When I was younger, I worked as a waitress in Philadelphia and New Jersey, she says. I learned useful things while serving food to strangers. I know how to rush around with my hands full, thinking about 6 things at the same time, which has stood me in great stead as the working mother of 2 small sons. I know that people are not at their best when they're hungry. That knowledge helps me to understand world events. If the citizens of the world were well fed, we'd have fewer wars and less mayhem. The most helpful thing I grasped while waitressing was that some tables are my responsibility and some are not. A waitress gets overwhelmed if she has too many tables and no one gets good service. In my life, I have certain things to take care of: my children, my relationships, my work, myself, and 1 or 2 causes. That's it. Other things are not my table. I would go nuts if I tried to take care of everyone, if I tried to make everybody do the right thing, if I went through my life without ever learning to say, sorry, hun, that's not my table. I would burn out and be no good to anybody. I need to have a surly waitress inside myself that I can call on when it seems everyone in the world is waving an empty coffee cup in my direction. My inner waitress looks over at them. Keeping her 6 balanced plates on her feet and moving, she says, sorry, hun, not my table. My children, my relationships, my work, myself, and 1 or 2 causes, that's it. And yet, even when we pare down to that clarity, I think we are still faced with the challenging choices in aligning our time with our values. The psychologist Marshall Rosenberg, who's the teacher behind the body of work Nonviolent Communication, but don't hold that against him, he offers this approach to aligning our time with our values. He starts by saying, when I advise don't do anything that isn't play, some take me to be radical. Yet I earnestly believe that an important form of self-compassion is to make choices motivated purely by our desire to contribute to life, rather than out of guilt, shame, duty, or obligation. when we're conscious of the life-enriching purpose behind an action we take, then even hard work has an element of play in it. By contrast, an otherwise joyful activity performed out of obligation or duty or fear or guilt or shame will lose its joy and eventually engender resistance. And he describes an activity, a practice that he began to engage in his life that changed things significantly for him. And I found it valuable myself, so one more practice. Step one, there's 3 steps. Step one, what do you do in your life that you don't experience as playful? You might make a list sometime if you feel called, but see what comes to mind immediately. Of all those things you tell yourself you have to do, any activity you dread, but you do it anyways because you think you have no choice. And he says, when I first reviewed my own list, just seeing how long it was gave me insight as to why much of my time was spent not enjoying life. I noticed how many ordinary daily things I was doing by tricking myself into believing I had to do them. The first item on my list was write clinical reports. I hated writing those reports, he said, yet I was spending at least an hour of agony over them every day. My second item was drive the children's carpool to school. So just hold on to 1 or 2 of yours if you can. And then step 2. After completing that list, you've got to acknowledge to yourself that you're doing these things because you choose to do them, not because you have to. He suggests insert the words "I choose to" in front of each item on your list. I recalled my own resistance to this step. He says, writing clinical reports, I insisted to myself, is not something I choose to do. I have to do it. I'm a clinical psychologist. I have to write these reports. But even just putting it down, I choose to. Step 3, after having acknowledged that you choose to do a particular activity, get in touch with the intention behind it. The intention behind your choice to do it by completing the statement. So I choose to write clinical reports because I want to. Because I want. What is it that you want? And here's what he says about his. At first, I fumbled to identify what I wanted from writing clinical reports. I'd already determined several months earlier that the reports did not serve my clients enough to justify the time they were taking. So why was I continue to invest so much energy in their preparation? Finally, I realized I was choosing to write the reports solely because I wanted the income they provided. As soon as I recognized this, I never wrote another clinical report. I can't tell you how joyful I feel just thinking about how many clinical reports I haven't written since that moment 35 years ago. When I realized that money was my primary motivation, I immediately saw that I could find other ways to take care of myself financially, and that in fact, and I think he's really serious about this, I'd rather scavenge in garbage cans for food than write another clinical report. How much of your chronos time is siphoned away by tasks like this? Tasks that steamroll through your days with the life-draining quality of have to. Then he says, the next item on my list of unjoyful tasks was driving the children to school, right? But when I examined the reason behind that chore, I felt appreciation for the benefits my children received from attending their school. They could walk easily to the neighborhood school, but their own school was far more in harmony with my educational values. I continued to drive, but with a different energy. Instead of, oh darn, I have to drive the carpool today, I was conscious of my purpose, which was for my children to have a quality of education that was very dear to me. Of course, sometimes I needed to remind myself 2 or 3 times during the drive to refocus my mind on what Purpose. What purpose my action was serving. Connecting to purpose. So that's really what that process is all about, connecting to purpose. One of those lifelines of our mission here. And it will sometimes lead us to make very different choices. And sometimes to make the same choices. But it's that connecting to purpose that leads us to an experience of kairos time. That experience of what the quality of the moment is asking for. What it serves. So cling to your purpose. The purpose that you truly value, that matters to you. Not just the high-minded purpose that you told yourself years ago that your life was all about. If you have one of those, that's great. But your purpose that includes frivolity and play, lingering moments with those you love, unexpected moments of awe and wonder at the vastness and beauty of the cosmos, bittersweet moments of authentic feeling. Hold on to purpose. And whenever you need to, just call up that surly waitress within and let them know, sorry, hun, not my table. May it be so.